You know, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is.
Right. It is totally binary.
Yeah, the bone is broken or it's whole.
Yeah.
You expect that kind of, clinical precision in medicine or engineering.
Sure.
But then you step into the world of ancient linguistics, and suddenly that clean, objective x-ray machine just shatters.
It really does. It gets incredibly messy.
You are looking at this linguistic landscape that is murky, shifting, and so tied to the psychology of the people actually speaking the words.
Yes, the psychology is everything.
Welcome to Reform Thinking. This is a deep dive into a single, seemingly ordinary ancient Greek word.
And it is a fascinating one.
It really is. The word is prasō, and we're going to look at its entire family of related terms.
Which is quite a large family.
Oh, yeah. And the hook for our analysis today is just wild to me. If you trace this single verb back to ancient epic poetry, it means to cross the sea.
Yes, it is a word of heroic adventure.
Right. But centuries later, by the time the biblical authors pick it up, it morphs into the technical term for bureaucratic extortion.
And dark magical arts.
Yeah. And the aimless, rotting swamp of human sin.
So how does a word devolve from a heroic ocean voyage to a tax audit and, well, spiritual death?
Well, to wrap our heads around that shift, we kind of have to look at the mechanics of human behavior. Because language is really just a mirror of how we think.
Makes sense.
The root of prassos is incredibly ancient. If you dig into the etymology, it traces back to the Indo-European root per.
Okay, per.
Right. And from there, it moved through the word para, which means beyond.
Oh, okay, like going beyond a boundary.
Precisely. And eventually it evolved into the Ionic Greek form praesh and the Attic form atu.
So built into the very DNA of this word is the concept of motion.
Yes. Physical, strenuous movement from one location to another.
So if you read Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, this word just leaps off the page, right? It comes with salt spray and sweat. Oh, absolutely. In Homer, it means to get beyond, to press on through, or to traverse a physical space.
When Homer uses it, he is picturing an ancient ship crashing through waves.
Pressing on through a violent storm.
Yeah, to reach a far shore, leaving a wake behind you.
But the thing is, the Greeks did not leave it on the water.
They brought it onto land.
They did. As their civilization developed and became more complicated, the physical voyage metaphor shifted into something abstract.
Like what?
Well, by the time you read writers like Pindar or the philosopher Plato, the physical seafaring context is totally gone.
Just erased.
Pretty much. It becomes a word describing total consuming action. It meant to busy oneself with a matter.
So if I am an ancient Greek citizen in Athens, instead of traversing an ocean, I'm traversing like a relentless to-do list.
That is the perfect way to look at it. It became the primary word for prosecuting a complicated legal case.
Oh, wow.
It became the word for managing state affairs politics, or the word scholars used for studying and analyzing complex dramas.
So it is all this heavy mental or bureaucratic lifting.
Yeah. Plato even uses it for minding one's own business or prosecuting a matter in the interests of someone else.
But there is a subtle change in focus here, isn't there?
There is a massive shift. When Homer used it, the focus was on the destination, the far shore.
Right. You are crossing the sea to actually get somewhere.
But over time, the destination fades. The focus shifts entirely to the intensity of the occupation.
The friction.
Yes, the daily grind of the crossing itself.
I see where this is heading. When a word focuses on the grind rather than the goal, it naturally attaches itself to endless grinding tasks.
It is inevitable.
Let's make an analogy for you listening. It is the difference between building a house and wading through city permit paperwork.
Oh, that is a great comparison.
Right, because building the house is actual creation. You have walls and a roof where there used to just be dirt.
You have a result.
Exactly. But the permit paperwork, that is just the grinding machinery of bureaucracy.
Yes, you are pressing through the system, but you are not actually making anything.
And that explains the financial twist that shows up in the historical sources.
Yes, it shows up heavily in ancient commerce and government. It becomes the verb for demanding and collecting public taxes or tribute or interest.
And because it's all about the mechanical pressure of the process, it kind of carries an aroma of extortion, doesn't it?
Very much so. Unlawful coercion. Thucydides, the Greek historian, writes about a king pressing a population for tribute.
Squeezing them for resources.
Right, and he uses this specific word, prasσω.
Because the king is not creating wealth. He is just frantically working the system to extract it.
He is just turning the gears.
We take noble concepts and reduce them to our daily grind. The tax collector, the bureaucrat, the politician, they are intensely busy.
They are pressing through their ledgers and their backroom negotiations.
But the outcome is often just more paperwork, more demands, more friction. But this raises a massive question. If this word describes all this intense human busyness, how did the ancient Greeks talk about the actions of their gods?
That is a great question.
Because the gods of Olympus are supposedly doing things constantly in the myths.
Right, they are always active.
Throwing lightning bolts, turning people into animals, fighting wars. Did they use prasshă for Zeus?
This is one of the most startling negative conclusions from the secular Greek sources.
Really?
Yeah. In ancient literature, prasshă is almost entirely absent when describing the acts of the gods.
Wow. So they threw a linguistic fence around this word.
They kept the divine out completely.
Wait, but if the gods are constantly interfering in human affairs, why guard this specific verb so closely?
Because the Greeks had a philosophical intuition about the difference between human striving and divine sovereignty.
Okay, unpack that.
Let's look at Plato's vocabulary to see the contrast. When Plato describes the gods fashioning the cosmos in his famous dialogue, the Timaeus, he needs verbs for action.
Sure, because they are building the universe.
Right, but he chooses words like poieō, which means making or creating.
Okay.
He uses ergazistai, which is working, or platin, which is fashioning.
So very constructive words.
Very. Out of hundreds and hundreds of uses of action verbs in his writings, Plato only assigns prasσω to the gods 3 times.
3 times, out of an entire philosophical corpus analyzing the nature of reality.
Just 3. And if you look closely at those 3 exceptions, they prove the rule.
How so?
He only uses it when he is making weak hypothetical comparisons to human action.
Like what kind of comparison?
For instance, he writes that a citizen should not say bad things about the gods because it might give the gods an excuse if they happen to do such things.
Ah, so it's a hypothetical scenario projecting human flaws onto the divine.
Spot on. Or he describes a festive mythological dance of the gods where each deity is minding his own business.
Minding his own business.
Right.
Which is that political bureaucratic usage we talked about.
Right. He never uses it for their actual divine, creative, universe-sustaining work.
Is this just a crook of Plato's writing style, though? What about the other Greek historians and poets?
The pattern holds across the board. Xenophon, another major philosopher and historian, only uses it once for a divine act.
Just once.
Yeah, and he uses it as a completely colorless, neutral term for the unseen God's rule.
Meaning what?
Well, he argues that the supreme God who is behind all other gods does the greatest things, but remains invisible to us.
Okay.
Older poets like Homer and Aeschylus occasionally use it to describe divine overruling, but always in a neutral way that avoids any ethical judgment.
But by and large, the gods do not prassess.
No, they do not.
It is like the ancient mind instinctively knew that humans strive and sweat, while the divine realm simply commands and completes.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it.
The gods create and affect successful outcomes. Humans, on the other hand, are just busy.
They are just spinning their wheels, which brings us to a fascinating synonym overlap we need to break down.
Let's hear it.
The distinction between process and that other word I mentioned, poieō.
Okay, the word for creating.
Yes. Xenophon gives us the Rosetta Stone for understanding the difference between these two concepts.
What does he say?
He uses a specific phrase, airon on poiein, that translates to make peace.
Okay.
When he uses poiein, it points to a successful outcome. The peace is achieved, the treaty is signed, the war is over.
So it is a done deal.
Yes. But then in another context, he uses the phrase peri aironis pratin.
And what does that mean?
That means to exert oneself to make peace.
Ah, so the outcome is entirely irrelevant in the second phrase.
Completely irrelevant.
It refers solely to the frantic effort, regardless of whether peace is actually achieved.
Precisely. Poiein guarantees the result. Prasshă only guarantees the sweat.
That is wild. Think about an artist in a studio. Poiein is the artist stepping back to look at a finished, beautiful painting hanging on the wall. The art exists.
Right.
Prasshă is the artist frantically mixing paints on the palette, washing brushes in dirty water, sweating over the canvas, just trying to force the image into reality.
Yes. One is the accomplished result. The other is the continuous, messy, unresolved activity.
And we see this dynamic played out beautifully in the philosophy of Socrates, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. When Plato is detailing the final hours of Socrates' life in the dialogue called the Phaedo, Socrates tells his friends about a recurring dream.
What happens in the dream?
In the dream, he is commanded to create musical art.
Create.
Right. And the Greek word used for that divine command is poieō, a mandate to bring a finished product into existence.
But Socrates responds differently, doesn't he?
He does. He responds by explaining that philosophy is something he was already engaged in.
Let me guess.
Yep. For his own human action, he uses a praton, the past tense of prásσω.
So philosophy for Socrates was a continuous process of inquiry.
An ongoing, grinding activity without a neat, finished product.
He recognized he was only mixing the paints.
He knew he was just in the process.
So prasō becomes the perfect analytical tool for philosophers examining the mechanics and motives of human behavior.
Completely apart from any final product. It puts the magnifying glass entirely on the process of human striving.
And the Stoic philosophers took this concept and built a whole worldview around it.
They really did. If you read Epictetus, you see that for the Stoics, the ultimate goal of the wise man is to align his thought, his will, and his action.
And the action here is prasō.
Exactly. They believed that human action, this continuous grind, should take place for the sake of the good.
But the Stoics have a very optimistic view of the human engine, don't they?
Extremely optimistic.
They assume the engine can be fixed if you just read the manual.
That is the fatal flaw in their system, which the biblical writers will dismantle later.
Because for Stoics, there's no real problem of a broken will.
Right. The gap between knowing what is good and actually doing it is just a lack of education to them.
If you teach a man the right way to think, his will and his prasō will naturally align.
Sin, or defective action, is not a structural failure of the human soul to a Stoic. It is just a lack of knowledge.
I want you to hold that Stoic optimism in your mind. Because when we cross into the theology of the New Testament, that idea is going to hit a brick wall.
A massive brick wall.
But before we open the Bible, we need to trace the shadow side of this word.
It gets pretty dark.
Because if human striving is just endless friction without a guaranteed result, it starts to take a very dark turn in the historical sources.
The descent of this word is grim. In the hands of historians like Thucydides and Polybius, prasō becomes the explicit term for treasonable proceedings.
Treason.
Treason and secret betrayals. When Thucydides describes political factions trying to betray a city from the inside, plotting in the shadows, he calls the traitors those who are practicing.
Those who are practicing treason. They are working the system for their own gain.
And the sources show it gets even darker.
How so?
In the ancient magical papyri, the actual documents detailing how to cast hexes and manipulate spirits.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, praxis is the technical term for performing a dark magical act.
So when you are standing in a graveyard trying to manipulate the spiritual realm to curse your neighbor, you are engaging in prasō.
You are practicing. So look at the baggage this word has accumulated over the centuries.
It is a lot.
We have a word that means frantic busyness, bureaucratic tax collection, political treason, and dark magic.
You can totally see why the Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek were incredibly cautious with it.
The Septuagint restraint is striking.
The Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Right. It was a massive undertaking requiring thousands of verbs. Yet the sources note that out of the entire Greek Old Testament, prasō is only used 38 times.
38 times in the whole Old Testament. That is a statistical anomaly.
It is incredibly rare compared to the hundreds of uses for other verbs of action.
When the Jewish translators needed to translate Hebrew words like asa, meaning to do or make, or halach, meaning to walk or behave, they actively avoided prasō.
They avoided it because they understood the mechanics of the word. They likely felt its abstract sense of process was far too weak to describe the authoritative creative work of the God of Israel.
Furthermore, the word was stained. It had the stench of shady business, extortion, and pagan magic clinging to it.
You do not use the vocabulary of a corrupt tax collector to describe Yahweh dividing the Red Sea.
No, you definitely do not. So when the Septuagint finally holds its nose and uses the word, it drips with condemnation.
Almost entirely. You find it mostly concentrated in the wisdom literature, where the authors are dissecting the folly of humanity.
What kind of folly?
It describes acting foolishly. It describes the horrific practice of infanticide occurring during pagan mystical ravings in the Book of Wisdom.
Goodness.
And in Proverbs 30, verse 20, it is used as a euphemism for the trade of the adulteress.
Why does a word that simply means process or activity become the go-to word for sin, betrayal, and prostitution?
It is a fascinating downward spiral.
Does continuous human activity, when left to its own devices, naturally trend downward toward deception?
The linguistic evidence suggests yes. When human action is disconnected from a divine creative purpose, when it is just the relentless friction of human wills competing against each other in a closed system, it devolves.
It becomes manipulation.
It becomes the backroom political deal, the secret betrayal, the frantic casting of a spell to force the universe to give you what you want.
Philo, the Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, draws a razor-sharp line here, doesn't he?
He does. He states that God's purposeful creation of the universe in the past is poieō.
The creating word.
Right. But his continuous, purposeless, sustaining work in the present is prasō.
Wait, Philo calls God's sustaining work purposeless. How does a Jewish philosopher justify that?
You have to view it through the lens of Hellenistic thought, which heavily influenced Philo.
Okay.
He viewed the initial creation of matter as the grand, purposeful design, the poieō.
The masterpiece.
Right. But the ongoing mechanical turning of the universe, the daily rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, he viewed as mere operational process prasō.
The fact that Philo applies this word to the mechanical turning of the cosmos shows how so tied the word had become to mundane, endless process rather than glorious creation.
Exactly. It is just the turning of the gears.
Which brings us to the New Testament, where the linguistic line in the sand is drawn in permanent ink.
Permanent ink.
The authors of the New Testament look at this word with all its baggage of extortion, magic, and aimless striving, and they make a staggering theological declaration.
The huge one.
In the New Testament, God never acts using the word prasō.
Not a single time.
Wow.
Out of 39 occurrences in the New Testament texts, the word is exclusively, universally reserved for human action.
The word is stripped entirely from the divine vocabulary.
And the statistical weight of how it is used for humans is heavy. Over 2/3 of those 39 uses carry a severe negative judgment.
So it is almost always bad news.
Positive or neutral uses are exceedingly rare. You have Acts 26:20, where Paul talks about doing deeds consistent with repentance.
Okay, that is positive.
Or 1 Thessalonians 4:11, where he tells the church to mind their own business.
But those are the rare exceptions.
The primary usage is dark, and nowhere is this clearer than in the writings of the Apostle John.
John loves his contrasts, right? Light and dark.
Yes, and the Johannine contrast between prasō and poieō is absolute. If you look at John 3:20 and John 5:29, John creates a severe dichotomy.
What does he say?
He writes that people practice evil, and the Greek phrase he chooses is phalla prassion.
Practice evil.
But when he talks about righteousness, he says that people do the truth, poieōn alethein.
He intentionally forces two completely different verbs into the text to separate evil and truth.
He really does.
Let's go back to our artist analogy. It is the difference between an artist forging a masterpiece, bringing truth and beauty into reality, and a criminal cranking out cheap counterfeits in a sweatshop.
That is a great image.
The sweatshop worker is busy, the machinery is loud, the brush is intense, but nothing of actual value is being created.
Just noise and friction.
Why does John refuse to give evil the dignity of the word poieō?
Because in the biblical framework, evil does not create anything. It has no ontological substance of its own.
It is a parasite.
Yes. It is a sterile, repetitive, aimless activity that only consumes what is already good.
Wow.
Truth, however, has a divine origin. Truth creates a lasting, eternal result. Doing the truth, poieō, is participating in the creative reality of God.
While practicing evil, prasō is just the empty, grinding friction of human rebellion.
It produces nothing but weariness.
Which brings us to the Apostle Paul and the theological climax of this entire linguistic study.
Paul's use of these words is brilliant.
His precision with these two verbs in the book of Romans is breathtaking. He wields these words like a surgeon using a scalpel to dissect the human condition.
We really need to do a close reading of Romans chapters 1, 2, and 7.
Let's do it.
Because the progression of Paul's grammar tells the entire story of human depravity.
Starting with chapter 1.
In Romans 1:32, Paul is describing the mass of pagan humanity. He paints a terrifying picture of a society rotting in a general swamp of vices, given over to their own desires.
And the word he uses for their activity is praxantes.
Yes.
They're just wallowing in the swamp. It is the unthinking, blind condition of a fallen humanity.
They are incredibly busy inventing new ways to sin, but their busyness is just the automatic grinding mechanism of their corruption.
They are slaves to the process.
And Paul pivots in Romans 2.
Right, he turns his attention.
In the first 3 verses of chapter 2, he turns his attention away from the pagan swamp and points his finger at those who possess the law of God and judge others.
The religious elite, the moralists.
And the moment he addresses the moralist, he switches verbs.
He drops prassi.
He uses poieō to describe their sin.
Let's pause here because this is crucial. If poieō usually means creation or bringing about a definitive result, why does Paul use it for the sin of the religious moralists?
Because the encounter with the divine law changes the very nature of the human action.
How so?
The general unthinking pagan condition is prasσω. It is blind flailing in the dark.
Right.
But when you possess the law, when you know the specific demands of God's holiness and you actively choose to judge others while doing the very same things yourself, your sin is no longer blind.
It becomes deliberate, knowing rebellion.
You are actively constructing an offense against the Creator.
The law gives sin a sharp edge.
Exactly. The moralist is taking the raw material of their depravity and intentionally forging a weapon with it.
That terrifying reality sets up the agonizing internal war of Romans chapter 7.
It really does.
This is one of the most famous, visceral passages in all of ancient literature.
Paul writes in Romans 7:15 and 7:19 about a brutal psychological and spiritual struggle.
He says that he does the evil he hates, and he fails to perform the good he wills.
And if you look at the Greek vocabulary, Paul chooses to describe this agony. The depth of his despair becomes crystalline.
Walk us through it.
He says he does prassō the evil he hates, but he fails to perform poieō the good he wills.
Let's bring back the artist metaphor, because it explains Paul's agony perfectly.
Okay.
Paul has the image of the masterpiece in his head. The law of God has shown him what the beautiful, finished painting of righteousness looks like.
Right. He knows what it's supposed to be.
He wants to paint it. He wills to poieō the good, but his hands are broken.
Completely broken.
When he steps up to the canvas, his hands frantically mix the wrong colors, wash the brushes in muddy water, and violently scrub dirt onto the canvas.
He is trapped in the prasσω.
He uses prasσω for the stupid, enslaved doing of evil without any purposeful fulfillment. He cannot stop the grinding machinery of his flesh.
But when he wants to accomplish actual lasting good, he uses the sharper word poieō.
And admits he utterly fails to achieve it.
This is the definitive rebuttal to the Stoic philosophers we analyzed earlier.
Oh, right, Epictetus.
Remember, Epictetus and the Stoics claimed humans just needed better information. If you educate the mind, the will and the actions align.
Sin is just a lack of data.
Paul uses the exact same Greek vocabulary of the philosophers to argue the absolute opposite.
Our will is entirely fractured from our actions.
The autonomous human will is completely broken. Education is insufficient.
Paul knows what is good. He has the ultimate education. He possesses the divine law.
But his knowledge cannot produce the poieō of the good. He is a slave to the prasσω of the flesh. His actions are bound.
The theological weight of that is staggering. It means humanity, left to its own devices, is trapped in an endless loop of aimless striving.
We cannot create our own righteousness.
We can only spin our wheels in the mud.
And that spinning of wheels does not just stay in the realm of abstract theology. It manifests in very specific, destructive ways in daily life.
Tell me more about that.
If we look at the noun and compound verb cognates of prasσω in the New Testament, we see a whole family tree of manipulation and extortion.
Let's walk through this family tree of busyness, because the sources give us 4 major cognates to examine.
The first is pragma.
Meaning what?
This means doing business, trading, or trying to make a profit. Jesus uses it in the parable of the 10 minas in Luke 19:13, where the nobleman hands out money and tells his servants to do business until he returns.
Is the language of commerce and transaction.
Then we have the noun practor.
Practor.
This is the bailiff or the exactor in charge of the debtor's prison.
Oh, that sounds ominous.
It is. In Luke 12:58, Jesus tells a sobering parable urging people to settle with their accusers on the way to court.
Or else what?
Because if you do not, you will be dragged to the judge, handed over to the practor, and thrown into prison until you pay the last penny.
The practor is the mechanism of legal extortion.
The third cognate is praxis.
Like the word practice.
Right. We see this vividly in Acts 19:18 during the burning of the magic books in Ephesus.
People who had practiced magic arts, the ancient attempts to extort the spiritual realm.
Right. They brought their scrolls and burned them in public, ending the victory of Jesus' name over the ancient spiritual extortion of magic.
Paul also uses praxis in Romans 8:13 and Colossians 3:9 to describe the evil practices of the flesh that must be put to death.
And finally, we have pragma.
Where does that show up?
This is found in 1 Thessalonians 4:6, where Paul warns believers not to transgress and wrong a brother in this pragma.
The context of this verse is debated by scholars, isn't it?
It is, but the sources break down three interpretive options. It could refer to business fraud.
Right.
It could mean engaging in malicious lawsuits. Or it could be a euphemism for sexual transgression.
The sources show that the context of overstepping boundaries and taking advantage of a brother, combined with the surrounding verses about holiness, points strongly to it being a euphemism for breaking the boundaries of a brother's marriage.
It fits the pattern.
So look at this family tree. What do a tax bailiff, an Ephesian sorcerer, and a fraudster have in common?
They are all manipulating the system. The root concept we discussed at the very beginning, pressing through or crossing a boundary, perfectly links all of these destructive behaviors.
Break that down.
The practor is exacting a financial toll, throwing you in a cage until he squeezes every coin out of you.
The sorcerer is engaged in praxis, attempting to cross a boundary to extort the spiritual realm, forcing unseen forces to do their bidding.
And the person committing fraud or sexual transgression, the pragma, is crossing moral and relational boundaries to take what does not belong to them.
It is the ultimate expression of human striving, completely divorced from the Creator's design.
It is fallen humanity trying to force the universe to yield to its desires through extortion, magic, and theft.
We are trapped in the prásō, trying to manipulate our way to fulfillment.
Which brings us to the final brilliant contrast in the New Testament usage of this word.
Where do we see it?
We see it deployed in the legal declarations of innocence for both the apostles and Christ himself.
This is where the historical precision of Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, truly shines.
In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul is on trial. He has been dragged through the mud, falsely accused by the religious leaders, beaten and hauled before Roman authorities.
Finally, he stands before the Roman governor Festus and the Jewish king Agrippa.
And Festus makes a formal legal declaration. He says in Acts 26:31 that Paul has done prassō, nothing worthy of death or chains.
Nothing worthy of death.
Luke intentionally parallels this scene with the trial of Jesus.
If you read Luke 23, Pilate is evaluating the accusations brought by the Sanhedrin against Jesus.
And Pilate makes a nearly identical legal declaration to the crowds. He says he finds no guilt in him regarding the things they accuse him of.
And that nothing worthy of death has been done, pragma, the passive form of prassō by him.
Both the Roman state and the Jewish kings are evaluating the prassō of the accused.
They are looking at the rap sheet. They are auditing the ledger of their human actions.
The divine irony here is thick. Look at the context. The authorities, Pilate, Festus, Agrippa, the high priests, they are frantically engaged in their legal machinations.
They are drowning in their own political prassō.
They are scheming, questioning witnesses, extorting the crowds, trying to find a human reason, a legal justification to execute these men.
Yet amidst all of this corrupt, frantic human busyness, both Jesus and Paul are declared completely innocent of any capital process.
The human system audits them and finds the ledger blank.
But we have to make a crucial distinction even here, because Paul and Jesus are not the same.
Right. Paul freely admits his own past guilt.
He stands before Agrippa in Acts 26:9 and confesses that he used to do many things against the name of Jesus of Nazareth.
Paul knows he is a sinner. He knows his own will was fractured and his hands were stained with the blood of the early church.
His innocence before the Roman court regarding treason is entirely distinct from Jesus' absolute perfect innocence before heaven and earth.
Absolutely.
Why does Luke rely on corrupt witnesses like Pontius Pilate or a dying thief on a cross to declare this innocence?
It is a deliberate choice.
The thief on the cross next to Jesus says, "We are receiving what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." He uses a different Greek word for done, but the conceptual reality is identical. Why highlight these deeply flawed testimonies?
Because it proves that human computation and human legal processes simply cannot handle the reality of what is happening on the cross.
The human system of prassō of the courts, the evidence, the ledgers of right and wrong, is entirely inadequate to judge the divine reality standing before it.
The innocent suffers for the guilty, dictated by a divine necessity that operates completely outside of human doing.
God's redemptive work is not a product of human prassō. It subverts it entirely.
Human action demands that the guilty pay. Divine grace demands that the innocent substitute himself for the guilty.
This has been a massive linguistic evolution. We started with ancient Greek sailors pressing through the waves, crossing a raging ocean to reach a far shore.
We watched the word devolve over centuries, losing its destination and becoming obsessed with the intensity of the grind.
We saw it morph into the technical term for tax collection, bureaucratic extortion, and secret political treason.
We saw how the ancient Greeks intuitively knew their gods, did not engage in this kind of frantic busyness, guarding the word and reserving it only for humans.
We saw the Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew scriptures recoil from it, using it almost exclusively to describe the foolish, the wicked, and the adulterous.
We watched the Apostle John use it to describe the sterile, aimless practice of evil, contrasting it with the lasting divine creation of doing the truth.
We felt the sheer agony of Paul in Romans 7, trapped in the mechanical prasσω of his fallen flesh, desperately wanting to paint the masterpiece of the law, but unable to create the good he willed.
And finally, we saw the frantic, manipulating prasσω of human courts utterly fail to compute the perfect, finished, redemptive work of Christ.
If the Greek text strictly reserves the purposeful, creative, finishing work poieō for God, and leaves humanity with prasσω, our endless, restless, often misguided striving, how might you look at your own daily calendar differently?
That is the real question, isn't it?
When you look at your schedule tomorrow, are you exhausting yourself in the endless loop of prasσω, frantically trying to extort value, meaning, and righteousness out of a broken system?
Or are you resting in the finished, purposeful work of the Creator who accomplishes what our fractured wills never could?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.